All right, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Christopher Smith, and I have the pleasure of serving as Dean of Students at the University of Arkansas Hope Texarkana, and welcome to our second virtual Lunch and Learn. Last month's was in regards to Black History Month, and this month, March, is Women's History Month, and we have a very special guest, Dr. Angela Boswell. And I will turn it over to Amanda Maggio, who will introduce her. And then afterwards, we will open the Zoom floor to Dr. Boswell. So Mrs. Maggio, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Angela Boswell is the Dean of the Locke Ellis College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of History at Henderson State University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, where she has taught United States and women's history for over 2 decades. She received her PhD and MA in history from Rice University and her BA in history and English from Southwestern University. Boswell's research focuses on American women's history, particularly Southern U.S. history. She has authored her Act and Deed, Women's Lives in a Rural Southern County, 1837 to 73, which won the Liz Carpenter Award for the best scholarly book on the history of women in Texas, and has co-edited 3 volumes on Southern women's history, including the award-winning Women in Civil War Texas. Her latest book is Women in Texas History, a narrative spanning from the prehistoric to the present, published in 2018 by Texas A&M University Press. It has won the Robert A. Calvert Book Prize, the Liz Carpenter Award, the Lone Star Book Award, and the Temple Vic Award. And Dr. Boswell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I appreciate it. I'm very excited. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great, wonderful. Now, this is a picture and it's obviously a drawing and it's a rendering. And I'm hoping that some of you are a little confused because that doesn't look like 19th century clothing or 20th century clothing, which we know is when women had the right to vote. But here, these are women voting. What's going on here is that in 1776, when the colonies declared their independence from Britain, part of the reason they did so is because, no taxation without representation. And as each colony declared its independence and they put together a state constitution, one of the things that happened is in New Jersey, they allowed all persons who owned at least 50 pounds worth of property to vote. That was all persons. And married women at this time, anytime women got married, all of their property went to their husbands. So most women couldn't vote because they didn't own property, their husbands did. But unmarried women who owned at least 50 pounds worth of property in New Jersey in 1776 were voting, along with the men. And so this is a remarkable movement. And one of the things that is happening during the American Revolution is that they are thinking about and looking about who has rights and who has the rights to do things. And New Jersey thought, if you're paying taxes, even if you're a woman, you should have the right to vote. Now, this didn't last for very long. By 1800, New Jersey had changed its mind and repealed it. None of the other colonies, none of the other states followed suit. And what happened is the idea about suffrage and who should be able to vote began to change in different ways. And instead of property owning people, what they then decided and what would become the trend in every state throughout the early 19th century was that white men, whether they owned property or not, were the ones who were allowed to vote. And so this disfranchised African Americans who might own property, it disfranchised women, and that owning a white skin was really what you needed in order to be able to participate in our democracy. This continued, of course, for many, many years, but one of the things that happens is in the Northeast, beginning in the 1830s, you have women who begin getting involved in movements, in clubs, in ways of changing society. Part of that is because in the Northeast, you have the Industrial Revolution. You have the increase in urbanization. So women were living closer together. They're dealing with all these changes in the 19th century that are occurring, and they want to perfect society, and they have this ability to work together to make some changes. One of the changes that many women in the Northeast got involved in was the abolitionist cause, and this was the desire to end slavery. Now, in the Northeast, by this time, there was no slavery, so they were trying to end it in the South. In the southern states, they believed that slavery was inherently wrong. One of the things that happened as they were fighting to end slavery is many women realized that they didn't have the power or the right to get anything done because they didn't have the right to vote. And two women in particular, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who had been denied the right to attend an abolitionist convention because they were women, were upset by this, and they decided to call a women's rights convention to talk about all the rights women didn't have. I already mentioned they didn't have the right to own property if they were married. They didn't have the right to divorce. They didn't have the right to custody of their own children, etc. So they called this convention. And what's really remarkable is that in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848, they issued a call for a women's rights convention. They published it in the newspaper, and it happened 2 weeks later. And over 100 people attended this convention, just like that. The desire to talk about women's rights was very powerful. And one of the things is that it was attended by women and men, and it was attended by both white and blacks. And particularly a lot of the African-American men who were very involved in the abolitionist campaign were strong proponents of women's rights as well. As women's rights, many people who were for women's rights were for abolitionists as well. Well, they discussed all of the problems, the social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women. But what was most remarkable about this convention in 1848 is that at the end, they issued a call for the right to vote. One of the resolutions is that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Now, one of the things that's happening here, and I'm going to emphasize as I talk here, is that they are saying, because we are human beings, we have the right to vote. Because African Americans are human beings, they have the right to freedom and even to vote. Well, the movement will grow from Seneca Falls. People join, people like Lucy Stone, a Boston socialite, people like Sojourner Truth, who, if any of you have ever heard the speech, Ain't I a Woman? She gave it at a women's rights convention. She was a former slave. And of course, probably the most famous that you know is Susan B. Anthony, who joined and became very close friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had 5 small children and couldn't really go out on the trail advocating for the right to vote, but she was really the one who was articulating the rights of women and that women should have rights because they were human beings. And Susan B. Anthony was the voice of the movement. So the movement is growing in the early 1800s, but it's not going to be growing, as you can guess, in the South. And one reason is because, well, the North and the South are very different. There was no industrialization. Women weren't in cities working together doing things. That's part of it. The other reason that it's not growing in the South is because Southerners are going to associate the women's rights movement with abolitionism, and they are protecting slavery. They're determined to protect slavery in the South. So there's not a women's rights movement in the South before the Civil War. The Civil War is going to be a watershed in many ways in the women's rights movement. During the Civil War, Northern women postponed the fight for the right to vote and instead contributed their services to the Civil War, thinking that the government would recognize their services and give them the right to vote afterward. In the South, of course, women had to take over a lot of their duties, but a lot of men's duties during the war. But at the end, they were shell-shocked. They were destroyed, they were tired, and they were more than happy to just give back and allow the men to come back. Now, there are some Southern states following the Civil War, some Southern legislators, very few, who actually in the constitutions that were put forth in the Southern states after the war, they suggested that women should have the right to vote, but they were very much the minority, and there wasn't a women's movement in the South for this reason. What did happen after the Civil War is that the national government decided that what they needed to do was enfranchise African American men. And the reason that they wanted to enfranchise African American men was really to figure out how to make sure that they could protect themselves in a South that was no longer occupied by Union troops. And so Congress passed the 14th Amendment. Now, when they proposed the 14th Amendment, this is really important to the women's rights movement, because the women and African American men had been fighting alongside each other for rights. And the 14th Amendment will be the first time that the word male is introduced into the Constitution. And so women's rights advocates, many of them said, no, we must oppose the 14th Amendment until it enfranchises both African Americans and women. There were other women in the women's rights convention movement that said, this is the time for the African American man, and we need to support the 14th Amendment and work for women later. This was such a major issue that the women's rights movement split. The American Women's Suffrage Association supported the 14th Amendment, whereas Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and the National Women's Suffrage Association opposed the 14th and the 15th Amendment because it introduced male. It gave African American men the right to vote instead of, and not women. And in fact, unfortunately, the National Women's Suffrage Association used very racist language. How can you give ignorant people the right to vote when you're not giving it to, good white educated women? And so this split in the suffrage movement is going to have a huge effect, and the suffrage movement is going to be slowed down. What Susan B. Anthony and others in the National Women's Suffrage Association turned to now was trying to get the right to vote through the courts. And in 1872, since Susan B. Anthony attempted to vote, actually she did vote and was arrested for voting, and she was anxious to take this to the Supreme Court. But some kind soul decided to pay her fine for her so that she could get out of jail. And so she wasn't able to appeal it. But Virginia Happersett was able to do the same thing. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was not in the Constitution that women would have the right to vote, and states could decide whether or not women had the right to vote. So now that it was a state decision, what you'll see is that the Suffrage Association begins working in each state, trying to state by state get the states to allow women the right to vote. It was a slow slog, but by 1890, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association came back together. They healed their split, and that is when they became known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Now, NAWSA began working on this plan state by state to get women the right to vote in each and every state. And where they were the most successful was in the West. And one reason they were more successful in the West is because, well, the women were just a lot tougher back there in the West. These pictures show you that. But also women in the West were able to enter more occupations. Women in the West were more desired. In fact, the first territory to allow women the right to vote was Wyoming. They didn't have enough voters in Wyoming to become a state. So if they enfranchised women and encouraged more women to move to Wyoming, they could become a state. So you have this desire in the West in this change. The other reason that it's more successful in the West, quite frankly, in the late 1800s, is because there's less organized opposition the states just hadn't been around as long to have the political opposition. And so by 1900, you'll see these purple states, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, had all given women the right to vote. But that was it. By 1900, by 1910, no other states did. And NASA was organizing in each and every state, but they were not being successful. They were relying upon this idea that women are people and therefore deserving of equal rights. They were relying upon an intellectual argument. What is going to change, though, is the growth in the movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is going to endorse suffrage and advocate that women have the right to vote. One reason they wanted women the right to vote is so that they would outlaw alcohol, which means that the alcohol industry is now fighting very hard to keep women from having the right to vote. Another late development in the 1800s, early 1900s is the growth of the women's club movement. They start by, studying Shakespeare, and then suddenly they are passing laws, getting laws passed in their cities to regulate milk and water. And this movement grew, and every state had a federation of women's clubs, and they joined the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And this was a powerful movement. And when the General Federation of Women's Clubs began sending to their state clubs saying, you need to really study the issue of suffrage, you have this massive movement of elite white women who are endorsing suffrage for the first time and working towards it. There's also a movement, a federation of women's clubs among African Americans. And the Colored Federation of Women's Clubs also endorsed suffrage, and they were also working towards it. But that created a problem for white suffragists, because in order to state by state get the right to vote, they had to appeal to Southerners. And so for a while, the National Association endorsed very racist strategies in order to get the support of Southern women. And as you can see here, the Southern States Woman Suffrage Conference will even break away from the national conference eventually. But one of the things that they're arguing is make the Southern states white. Their argument is give white women the right to vote, and therefore you'll drown out all the African American votes. And this is why they wanted the Southern states to give them the right to vote. The National Association endorsed this and pushed it forward. But what happens is not a single Southern state gave women the right to vote. And by the early 1900s, Jim Crow laws had basically disenfranchised African Americans in the South anyway. So it was no longer, it was never a good strategy, but it was no longer even a relevant strategy. Meanwhile, at the national level, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the leaders of the national movement, are dying off, and they're passing the torch to women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch. Now, these women were much more politically savvy than Anthony and Stanton had been, and they began lobbying legislators. They began using politics. They began saying, we will support the men who give us the right to vote. And they worked very hard to do this. They also changed their strategy. Instead of saying, hey, women should have the right to vote because they're human beings, they began changing their strategy and arguing women are more moral than men, and therefore you should allow women to vote because they'll clean up politics. And that became the new argument, an argument that particularly appealed to the women's club movements. And this is the strategy that they took. This strategy in the early 1900s helped a little bit. By 1914, you had several more states who had allowed women the right to vote. You will notice they are still all in the West. No southern states and no northeastern states. This is stalling the movement, it's frustrating the movement, and the women are beginning to look for a national amendment. Instead of trying to take this state by state, what we need is an amendment to the Constitution. And so they introduced the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which would require all states to allow women the right to vote. This amendment, again, split the movement. Why? Well, the National Association is working towards this national amendment, but the Southern women who were working towards suffrage, such as Kate Gordon in New Orleans, Kate Gordon in Louisiana, but this is happening throughout all the southern states, including Arkansas. They argued against a national amendment. One, they wanted their state to give them the right to vote. And two, they were, like many Southerners at the time, against anything that the national power, that gave the national government more power over the states. And so you still have this desire, what do we do? How do we get women the right to vote? And these different strategies involved. Meanwhile, a new young group of Southern suffragists, or national suffragists, American suffragists emerged. Alice Paul, who got training in England in the suffrage movement, she came in and she organized a new suffrage association, the National Woman's Party, that was very political. She organized the great big Washington, D.C. parade to bring attention to the issue, which ended in total melee here. As you can see, men just rushed the parade after a while, and women who were marching for suffrage were beaten. This brought a lot of attention to suffrage, but it didn't get any movement at the national level. By World War I, with World War I breaking out, this again was the decision to make. Hey, during the Civil War, we worked for the government thinking that they would give us the right to vote. Well, that didn't work. So which should we do? Continue to fight for the right to vote, or help the government, help the country win the war? And NASA, the official organization, said, we're going to do both. We're going to get women suffragists to help win the war while fighting for women's suffrage. Alice Paul and the National Woman Party said, no, we're not fighting for any country that denies us the right to vote. And they began the famous pickets of the White House, particularly calling Woodrow Wilson, the president, out for fighting a war for democracy elsewhere and denying women. Woodrow Wilson was not fond of these women. And he ordered them arrested for trespassing, basically. And they refused to pay their fines. And Alice Paul led a hunger strike of the women in prison. And the women in prison for protesting for women's suffrage, they were force-fed. And this force feeding is going to draw a lot of attention and sympathy towards the suffrage movement. But even though it brings a lot of sympathy towards the suffrage movement, there are a lot of people who are still pretty angry that women are protesting the White House in the middle of the war. And so you still have a split in how do we accomplish suffrage. But Harriet Blatch that I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, she had organized women in New York. And they had, over the past 20 years, been lobbying the legislators in New York to grant woman suffrage to the people, to the women of New York. They had lobbied them. They had identified those who were not going to vote for them. They had worked in political campaigns to get rid of them. They had threatened the Democratic Party. They had threatened anyone who would not work for them. And it paid off. When New York grants woman suffrage, this becomes really the key. both all the attention that had been focused on those women who were protested and jailed for woman suffrage, and the fact that women were going to be able to vote in New York and therefore vote for politicians who were supporting them. And New York was a big block at this time. These things pushed Woodrow Wilson to finally endorse woman suffrage, and January 10th, 1918, a vote on the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was finally scheduled in U.S. Congress. Now, what happens after this, of course, is that once Congress passes the amendment, it goes to the states for ratification. It needs 3/4 of the states to ratify, which means they're going to need some southern states. Now, before the suffrage amendment went to the states, these dark blue states had all granted full suffrage to women. The light blue states had granted partial suffrage to women. The yellow and the orange were local, basically women could vote at the local level. So you've got some range there. And of course you have a lot of the South here who is still not granting women the right to vote in anything. But I want to bring your attention to Texas and Arkansas and Tennessee particularly, but particularly Texas and Arkansas. Now let me talk about Arkansas for just a minute. I have enough time to do it, I'm going to. I'm going to talk about Arkansas for just a minute. Women in Arkansas had been working for the right to vote longer than even in Texas. In 1868, when a legislator in Arkansas had suggested that women should get the right to vote in the Constitution, the same thing had happened in Texas. There wasn't a single woman that stepped forward in Texas and said, hey, yeah, I agree with you. But in Arkansas, there were. So even as early in the 1860s, you've got some brave women in Arkansas saying, hey, we should have the right to vote. You have in 1870s, you have a woman suffrage association formed. When the leader of it died, it sort of fizzled out. In the 1880s, you have a woman suffrage association. When the leader stepped down, it fizzled out. So you have this sort of wave after wave. Women were interested. They wanted the right to vote, but it's going to be in the 19-teens when they're able to mount a major campaign. And in this major campaign, they were able to convince and draft the governor's wife into this campaign. And she supported suffrage and her husband supported woman suffrage. So Arkansas is going to be the first, and Texas will do basically the same thing. And they grant women, because you don't have to have a constitutional amendment to do this, they grant women the right to vote in the primaries. Texas, Arkansas, most of the South, and all of the South at this time, there was really only one political party. The Democratic Party, which was the white party, was the only one that was ever going to win a general election. And so giving women the right to vote in the primary, in essence, really gave them the right to choose who the elected representatives were going to be. It gave, let me clarify, it gave white women the right to choose who the elected. So what happens in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Texas is that these women are now able to shift from fighting for their right in their state, and they are shifting to fighting for that national amendment. And so when the national amendment is sent to the states, you're going to see all of these states ratified it, but Texas will be the first southern state to ratify it in June. Texas is the first southern state, the 9th state total. Arkansas is the 12th out of 36 states to ratify. That's pretty progressive for Arkansas. I have theories about it, but in many ways, Arkansas and Texas were as much Western as they were Southern. They were very, very Southern, don't get me wrong. But they also, for the same reasons, recognized the work of women, and women were doing more of these male occupations. So this is a big change. But as you can see, all the gray states did not ratify, and the suffragists needed one more state in order for the 19th Amendment to pass, and that state came down to Tennessee. It was clear that it was going to be Tennessee, and everyone, the whole nation, the anti-suffragists, the suffragists, they all converged on Tennessee to try to convince that legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment. They had a code by which the legislators who supported suffrage wore yellow roses, and the legislators who opposed it wore red roses. The woman suffragists had great success. They lobbied it, and they thought they had enough members, and then some had changed their mind. And the day they showed up, they counted all the red roses, they counted all the yellow roses, and it was clear that suffrage was going to be defeated by one vote in Tennessee. It was a sad day, but they were still holding their breath. And one legislator took off his red rose, and when it came time to vote to ratify, he voted for woman suffrage. And when he was later asked why, he said that he had just gotten a letter from his mother asking her to give women the right to vote and to help poor Carrie Chapman Catt out in winning this campaign. And so by one vote, Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Now, when I say they gave women the right to vote, it did. It allowed women, you can no longer refuse the right to vote to women. But in the South, you could still, through the Jim Crow laws, refuse the right to vote to African Americans. And so white women received the vote in 1920, but it will be a civil rights movement later before African American women will have the right to vote, and the 70s before Native American women have the right to vote. So when we celebrate the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we are celebrating this major milestone. But let's not forget that it's going to take a while before we actually have universal suffrage in the United States. All right, I did it in 30 minutes. And that was so hard. But I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. All right. Either I just told you everything you needed to know or what? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Dr. Boswell, could you expand a little bit more on what changed to what was in place to prevent Native American women from being able to vote, and then what changed to allow them to in the 70s?
Native Americans weren't allowed to vote in the United States. The argument is that they voted in their tribal areas, in their tribes, and that was their ability to vote, even though we had long since declared that they weren't nations and that they really couldn't rule themselves. Still, that was the argument. And it was in the 1970s, after the American Indian movement of the 1970s, before Native Americans were granted the right to vote. Interesting, huh? Other questions or comments? Usually what I do to my students when they don't ask questions, I threaten to keep talking.
I think you really just kind of wowed the crowd, because I can speak for myself. In K-12, we were taught 1920 and Susan B. Anthony, and now we're hearing about 1970s for Native Americans, and I'm familiar with the civil rights movement and how that kind of paved the way for African Americans to vote. But yeah, that was an eye opener. I just assumed that Native Americans were able to vote. So that, I think that's very interesting. The whole presentation was wonderful. and it's not that far, wasn't that far along. Was about 40 years or no, 50 for Native Americans, for civil rights movement that was 60, close to 60, 50 to 60 years ago. And now we kind of see in a national landscape of where there are more kind of legislation. I see where Georgia is trying to put in various laws to quote unquote protect elections. Are you seeing kind of a trend of that, not just in Georgia, but other states or anything along those lines?
Yes, there's a movement in the country right now to restrict voting. And you know, in part of what I was talking about here too, is the different ideas about who should vote and why. Women thought they should vote because, well, in New Jersey in 1776, they owned property, they paid taxes. Why don't I get a right to vote? But the whole argument of, if you're a human being in a republic or a democratic republic as we are, then you should have a voice in who is making laws and representing for you. That is a very broad argument. But then there are others who have said, well, only if you own property, or for a long time, only if you were a white man. And so this has been, you know, our dream in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it was a dream. It wasn't a statement of fact. And we've spent over 200 years trying to perfect that dream. But there's still the intellectual arguments as to who really should decide who should govern. Are there people who don't know enough about what should happen? And these arguments go all the way back to, well, they go all the way back to England, but they go all the way back in our country. And so we're seeing a resurgence in this, is that, you know, we need to protect our elections, but we also need to restrict voting to just those people who know what's best. And for a lot of people, that means restrict voting to people who will vote just like me. So we still have gerrymandering, as well as voting restrictions, this idea of keeping a political party in power. And if you are that political party and you think you know what's best for the nation, then maybe it's a good idea to, you know, use anything at your control to keep your party in power, because you know what's going on. But that's not the way that we have in this country evolved to believe. We believe that there is representation.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the chat. I'll read it for you.
Thank you.
Given some of the voting rights rollbacks that are being proposed now, are there particular historical lessons that we should pay attention to now to protect future rights?
Yes. Did I mention that the fight for women's right to vote began in 1848? And based upon this general intellectual, hey, you know, we should all have the right to vote, it didn't get anywhere. Where it got, when you got places, is when you participated in the political process. When you said, I'm going to vote for you, I'm going to work to get you unelected. That is what got women the right to vote. Men didn't just wake up and say, hey, you know, you're right, you are human beings, you should have the right to vote. It was because this is politically expedient. This is what's going to. And so the lesson from this is that, one, be ever vigilant. We just can't let down our guard to protect our right to vote. And two, you have to be involved in the political process. You have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to who's trying to take away your right to vote. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. You have to express that this is important to you and that this is going to affect your vote. And so those are the lessons that I would take away from it is be ever vigilant, stay involved in the process. Because if you don't voice your opinion, you will lose your right to voice your opinion. Was there another message in the chat? I saw that there were two, but I didn't read them.
I'm just seeing one.
Okay.
If there was another one, someone please chime in. And looking at this, especially in particular for Women's History Month, I know now we have the largest amount of women represented in Congress. And so can you kind of expound upon the, I guess, history or processes with it, because it ties into Achilles' question in regards to how to prevent the rollbacks, for future voters, but also we're looking at an increase of women running for office, being elected. How do we make sure that the playing field more so is more leveled and there's actual more representation?
That's a great question. And that could be another 30, 45-minute presentation easily. But here's the really short answer is that when women got the right to vote, a lot of women thought, okay, this is going to change everything. But women have to get involved in politics. Getting the right to vote is the first step, but you actually have to get involved in the political process. And one of the things that's difficult for women running and is that they're not encouraged to do so. At the local level, you have a lot of men saying to other men, look, you need to get involved in politics if you want your business career to take off. You have to do this. This is what you have to do in order to be successful, is you have to be involved in the local party or the local elections. And boy, you've got leadership skills. Why don't you run for this? Women are less likely to be encouraged, and women are more likely to get involved and run for office when they are motivated by particular issues, they want to clean milk. I mean, that I talked about with the Federation. They want to protect their communities. They want to change the school board. I mean, they're more likely to run for those reasons than for their own political gain and political career. Not that men aren't running for good reasons too, but they're more likely to be encouraged as a benefit to their careers and their abilities. So that's part of what is going on. We are seeing an increase in women, but I mean, 101 years, and we are celebrating, I think that women are now 18% of the US Congress. We got a long ways to go. And so merely having the right, and this may be another lesson to learn, is merely having the right to vote is not enough. You actually have to really get involved and put yourself out there and run for office.
Dr. Boswell, I wonder, is there another women's suffrage-like movement on the horizon? And I think, maybe particularly the southern states, and Arkansas is a great example, where a predominantly male state legislature seems intent on legislating women's reproductive rights. Is something like that going to be the next thing that there is a women's movement in regard to?
There is every reason, looking at history, to expect that one of the things that we see is that you have women fight for the rights. You have a backlash. We had a backlash in the 1930s after women got the right to vote. In the 1930s, you had this massive backlash of you know, I mean, one, we were in a Great Depression, but two, two is that it's like if women would just give up their jobs and go home, there would be enough jobs for all the men. Women are just not being subservient, and that's why our economy is crashing. So you have this sort of surge, and then of course World War II. Hey, women, let's go, you know, work. And then afterwards, oh, women should go back to the home. But that is from where you have the massive movement of the 60s and the 70s, this feminist movement that fights for all sorts of women's rights, not just rights to vote. So from that feminist movement, we've had this backlash. And so there is, you know, for those of us who hope that women continue to have rights, we hope that there is a movement, and I see that brewing. I see a lot of people get complacent about things. Hey, this is law of land. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think about it. There are other things I want to think about. But then when it's challenged, it does bring another movement, another impetus towards organizing. But that doesn't mean that it'll happen and it'll be successful. You have to have people who will do it and will keep doing it despite the fact, hey, this fizzled out. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, Brian, but yeah, I think that women are more involved in politics now, and that's going to make a difference. Arkansas is always a little bit behind the nation, but you know, Arkansas is not that bad. I mean, they were the first to grant women in the first southern state to grant women primary suffrage. So you're there.
All right. A second question we have: do you recommend any current women's organizations to become more educated and more involved with?
This is where the fact that I am a historian comes into it makes it very difficult. I can name a whole lot in the 19th century for you to get involved in. I don't really know. When I was in Texas, I was the executive director of the Texas State Women's Political Caucus, which was a caucus of the National Women's Political Caucus. And our goal was to get more women elected to public office. Arkansas does not have a statewide caucus of the National Women's Political Caucus. I recommend getting involved at your local level, looking at the issues at the local level. I definitely recommend that. There are some good national women's political organizations out there that can give, that can help with education and following. And I would, one's on the tip of my tongue, but it's not coming to me at the moment. But yeah, no. Wasn't prepared for that question. It's a great one though.
Good. Well, if you think of any, you can email and I'll be more than happy to share with our folks. And one comment, continuing women's rights is similar to civil rights. It's a constant effort. When we be quiet about, in regards to this, we are agreeing to all the injustices that come with not having equal rights. A constant effort towards change is what is needed to further women's rights.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And here's the other thing is that when we are silent about restricting the rights of anyone, then we are complicit in allowing our own rights to be restricted. It's very easy to say, hey, this doesn't affect me, it affects this other group, let them fight it. But when you're silent in the face of oppression of anybody, you're next. So
it's a good way to put it. Ashley, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Dr. Boswell, this is sort of pull you back into the historical realm. Okay. What really sort of set the stage for Hattie Caraway in Arkansas? I mean, we're what, 15 years after suffrage that she gets elected to the Senate?
Well, you have this habit in the Senate and in the U.S. Congress of when a representative dies in office, just put his wife in there because she will be a placeholder. If you appoint some other man, then you're giving him the edge in the next election. So you just, stick the wife in there because she's never going to run for office. Well, Hattie Caraway said, yeah, I think I will. Now, they called her Silent Hattie, and, there's all sorts of jokes about it, but she not only ran for office and won, she had the support of a grassroots movement in order to do so. So this grassroots movement, harkening back to Louisiana, as I'm sure you know, Ashley, and Huey Long, and in the 1930s, this is poverty and is a major, and class is a major issue. So there were a lot of Arkansans who were in really bad straits in the 1930s, and she appealed to them and promised to assist them. And so, yeah, she is far ahead of any other state, really, and being a woman elected in her own right to the Senate, running. So the Depression and this habit of sticking women in, she finished out her husband's term and then ran for another term and was a successful senator. I love Hattie Caraway's story.
Good. Well, we are closing in on the 1 o'clock hour. Are there any other comments or questions? I want to be respectful of Dr. Boswell's time. And okay. Don't see anything, Dr. Boswell. Anything, last words?
Yes, thank you for having me. I love to talk about this subject, and I love to share with others. I can't believe that so many of you joined me on your lunch hour to talk about this. So this was quite an honor, and I'm very excited. So thank you for thinking of me and allowing me to celebrate Women's History with you.
Wonderful. We're greatly appreciative, and you're getting some thank yous coming in from a former student of yours, Brian Smith.
Brian, yes.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for attending. Thank you again, Dr. Boswell, for a wonderful presentation. And this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube page and for everyone to view for future reference.
Thank you.